In 1845, in Ireland, the disaster did not first look like a battlefield. It looked like a field. A man could walk outside, pull a potato plant from the soil, and find the food beneath it turning black, soft, rotten, useless. The disease moved through the crop almost silently, but what followed was famine, collapse, eviction, hunger, and a wound so deep it changed the history of an entire people. And at the center of it was one of the most ordinary foods on earth. Today, a potato feels harmless. It can be mashed beside dinner, sliced into chips, buried under salt, or dropped into hot oil until it becomes something golden and forgettable. It is cheap enough to ignore. But before it became ordinary, the potato had already crossed oceans, fed empires, filled poor stomachs, strengthened armies, and made entire societies believe that survival could be built around one crop. The real question is not how a potato became food. The question is how one small crop became powerful enough to feed millions and expose the hunger hidden inside a whole system. Look at the potato when it no longer looks like a potato. It may arrive in a paper sleeve, salted so heavily that your fingers shine. It may come as chips inside a loud plastic bag. It may sit in the freezer aisle, already peeled, cut, shaped, and waiting for oil. It may be mashed beside meat, baked under cheese, or pressed into a hash brown so uniform it feels less like a crop than a design. That is how the potato survives in modern life. By becoming too familiar to notice. A worker behind a fast food counter opens a frozen bag. The pieces inside are pale, stiff, and almost identical. They slide into the fryer with the sound of ice meeting oil. A timer starts. A basket rises. Salt falls. Within minutes, something that once came from dark soil has become golden, hot, predictable, and cheap. No one at the counter needs to imagine a mountain field in the Andes. No one needs to imagine a tenant family in Ireland watching a crop fail. No one needs to imagine the argument that had to happen before Europe trusted this ugly underground tuber enough to feed people with it. That is the strange power of the potato. It hides its history by being useful. Unlike spices, it does not look exotic. Unlike chocolate, it does not feel luxurious. Unlike coffee, it does not announce itself as a ritual. The potato is quiet. It fills space. It stretches a meal. It sits beside other foods instead of demanding the center of the table. But background foods can build history. For most of human life, the problem was not flavor. It was hunger. A food did not need to be glamorous to become powerful. It needed to grow where people lived. It needed to give enough calories to carry a body through work, winter, rent, war, and another morning. It needed to turn land into survival. The potato could do that with brutal efficiency. A small plot could produce enough to keep a poor family alive. Bad soil did not always defeat it. Cold did not always destroy it. Hidden underground, it could survive weather that damaged grain above the surface. For people with little land and fewer choices, this was not a culinary preference. It was protection. And that is where the story becomes dangerous. Because a food that protects the poor can also hide how poor they are. If one crop can keep a family alive on a rented patch of land, then landlords, states, and markets can look away from the deeper question. Why does that family have only a patch? Why is survival balanced on one harvest? Why is a meal being asked to solve what land, wages, policy, and power refuse to solve? The potato did not create those questions, but it made them easier to postpone. That is why the potato belongs in a history of power, not just a history of food. It crossed oceans after conquest. It entered European gardens before it entered European trust. It moved from curiosity to policy, from policy to necessity, from necessity to dependency. It fed workers and soldiers. It helped poor families survive. Then, in Ireland, the crop that had made poverty survivable revealed how fragile that survival had been. But this is not only a story about one famine. If it were, the potato would remain trapped in the 19th century, inside a black field and a starving cottage. The more unsettling truth is that the potato kept changing shape. Modern industry did not abandon it. Industry learned how to make it faster. The potato became a standardized object. It could be washed by machines, sorted by size, cut into identical strips, frozen, shipped, fried, packaged, and served with the same color and taste almost anywhere. In the United States, potatoes are now often consumed not as whole tubers from a sack, but through processed forms, frozen fries, chips, dehydrated flakes, and other products designed for speed, storage, and repetition. A crop once valued because it could keep people alive became a product valued because it could move through systems efficiently. That change matters. When a potato sits whole in the dirt, it still belongs partly to weather, soil, disease, and the hands that pull it up. When it becomes a frozen fry, those things disappear behind uniformity. The consumer sees a side dish. The system sees yield, storage, transport, oil temperature, portion size, and price. The potato did not become invisible because it was unimportant. It became invisible because it became everywhere. So before we return to the ruined fields of Ireland, before we follow the potato across the Atlantic and back into the mountains where its story truly began, we have to hold the modern potato still for a moment, because the object in your hand is not just cheap food, it is the final shape of an old bargain. Give people enough calories to keep going, and they may not always see the system asking them to keep going on so little. Before the potato became a European food, it was a mountain memory. Its story begins far from the fryer, far from the supermarket, and far from the Irish field where the crop would one day fail. It begins high in the Andes, where the air is thin, the nights can freeze, and farming is less a matter of convenience than a negotiation with altitude. Near the region of Lake Titicaca, thousands of years before anyone in Europe knew what a potato was, people learned to work with plants that did not look impressive from the outside. These were not the large, smooth, pale potatoes stacked in modern grocery stores. They could be small, knotted, dark, red, yellow, purple, bitter, sweet, long, round, twisted, rough-skinned, and uneven. To an outsider, they might have looked like poor food. To the people who knew them, they were a library. Imagine a woman in an Andean field after the harvest. She is not simply picking through a pile of tubers, she is sorting experience. One variety may survive frost, another may grow better in thin soil, another may store longer, another may be saved for a ritual, a market, a family meal, or a season when the weather turns against everyone. The potato here was not one thing, it was many possible answers to a difficult landscape. That is one of the first truths modern people often miss. The potato did not begin as a standardized object. It began as diversity. In the Andean highlands, thousands of native potato varieties were selected over generations for taste, texture, color, shape, and survival. They were shaped not in laboratories or factories, but in fields where a bad decision could mean hunger months later. Every variety carried a small piece of local knowledge. A farmer did not need the language of genetics to understand risk. They could see it in the sky, feel it in the soil, remember it from a bad year, and answer it by planting more than one kind of potato. Diversity was not decorative. It was insurance. And this is where the potato's early history becomes more than agriculture. It becomes a way of thinking. The Andes did not offer easy farming. The land rose sharply. Weather changed quickly. Frost could arrive when plants were vulnerable. Rain could be unreliable. A crop that could survive underground, at altitude, in rough conditions, was not just useful. It was a form of stored time. Then came one of the strangest and most brilliant transformations in food history: chuño. At night, potatoes were left out under freezing Andean temperatures. In the day, the sun returned. People would press or trample the thawing tubers to squeeze out moisture, then let them dry again. Through freezing, thawing, pressure, and sun, a fresh potato became something lighter, harder, and far more durable. A food that might rot could now wait. Picture the ground covered with potatoes under the cold mountain sky. By morning, they are frozen. Feet press them, hands turn them. The sun dries them. Day by day, the water leaves, and what remains is not a fresh vegetable anymore. It is emergency food, travel food, military food, winter food, a way to move calories through time. That matters. Because survival is not only about growing food, it is about keeping food long enough for hunger to arrive. Long before modern factories learned to dehydrate, freeze, and package potatoes, Andean communities had already found a way to make the crop last. Chuño could be stored and carried. It could help people endure seasons when fields gave less. It could sit as a reserve against the future. The potato, in this world, was not humble in the way Europeans would later describe it. It was not lowly because it grew in dirt. It was powerful because it answered a landscape that punished weakness. But when the potato left the Andes, much of that context did not travel with it. The Spanish did not carry an entire mountain world across the Atlantic. They carried tubers, specimens, curiosities, useful plants pulled from a conquered continent and placed into a different imagination. What had been part of a living system of altitude, variety, preservation, and local knowledge became, in European eyes, an object. A strange object, a dirty object, an underground object. That loss matters, because the potato was safest in the world that understood its diversity. In the Andes, it had never been only one crop with one shape and one future. It had been many crops at once, spread across villages, slopes, seasons, and uses. Europe would learn the potato's power, but not immediately its lesson. It would learn that the potato could fill stomachs. It would learn that a field of potatoes could feed workers, soldiers, and poor families. It would learn that a crop hidden beneath the soil could become a weapon against hunger. But Europe would also narrow the story. The mountain library would become a tuber on a table. And before that tuber could change European history, Europeans first had to decide whether this ugly stranger from the conquered Americas was even safe to eat. When the potato reached Europe, it did not arrive as destiny. It arrived as something awkward. A tuber from a conquered world, carried across the Atlantic after Spanish contact with Peru, placed into a continent that already had its own ideas about proper food. Europeans knew grain. They knew bread. They knew fields that rose above the soil and could be seen, measured, taxed, blessed, and feared when they failed. The potato came from underneath. Imagine a room in the late 16th century. A table, a map of the Americas, a few dried plant specimens, a wooden box opened after a long sea journey. Inside are small, rough tubers, still strange to the eyes of the people handling them. They are not golden fruit. They are not fragrant spice. They are not wheat, wine, or sugar. They look like dirt that learned to swell. For botanists, that strangeness made the potato interesting. For ordinary eaters, it made the potato suspicious. A plant could be admired in a garden long before it was trusted in a pot. It could be written about, exchanged, and displayed, while still failing to become dinner. That is an important pause in the story. Europe did not simply receive the potato and understand it. Europe had to learn what the Andes already knew. It had to learn which climates suited it, when it formed tubers, how it behaved under different day lengths, how to store it, how to cook it, and perhaps most difficult of all, how to imagine it as food. The first European potatoes were not perfectly adapted to their new home. Plants taken from the Andean highlands had grown in a different rhythm of light and season. In parts of Europe, tubers developed late in the year, too close to frost. The crop that had been a mountain answer in one world became a biological puzzle in another. So the potato waited. It waited in gardens. It waited in experiments. It waited in suspicion. It moved from hand to hand before it moved from plate to plate. And underneath that slow acceptance was a cultural problem. Bread was not just food in Europe. It was symbol, ritual, labor, tax, market, and memory. Grain fields were visible signs of civilization. Bread sat at the center of the table and inside religious language. A buried tuber did not easily enter that world. It came from below. That mattered more than it should have. Foods have reputations before they have nutrition labels. People judge with the eye, the nose, the story, and the fear inherited from other people. The potato was ugly. It was foreign. It was connected to conquest. It belonged to the ground in a way that made it feel less noble than grain. Before it could feed Europe, it had to survive European imagination. Picture a farmer looking at the plant. The flowers might seem harmless enough. The leaves might even look ornamental, but the useful part is hidden under the soil. To harvest it, he has to trust what he cannot see. He has to dig. He has to eat the swollen underground stem of a foreign plant and believe it will not betray him. That kind of trust takes time. This is why the potato's rise was not only agricultural, it was psychological. A society had to change the meaning of a thing before the thing could change society. The potato had to move from curiosity to experiment, from experiment to emergency food, from emergency food to ordinary crop. Hunger helped make that change. When harvests failed, when grain prices rose, when poor families needed something that could produce more calories from less land, the potato began to look different. The same ugliness that made it seem lowly also made it useful. It did not require the same symbolic respect as bread. It did not need to replace bread at first. It could enter through the side door of poverty, crisis, and practicality. That was the opening. A food does not always become accepted because people love it. Sometimes it becomes accepted because people run out of better options. Then, after enough seasons, what was once suspicious becomes familiar. What was once foreign becomes local. What was once a dirty curiosity becomes something a mother boils, a soldier carries, a worker eats, and a government notices. This was the potato's second transformation. In the Andes, it had been protected by diversity and memory. In Europe, it would be tested by distrust, climate, hunger, and power. Once Europeans finally understood that this ugly stranger could fill stomachs with unusual efficiency, the potato would stop being merely a plant. It would become a tool, and tools attract the attention of people who govern. The potato became dangerous in Europe when powerful people stopped laughing at it. For a long time, it could be dismissed as strange, foreign, low, or ugly. But hunger has a way of changing taste. So does war. So does the simple arithmetic of feeding many bodies from limited land. A ruler did not need to love potatoes to understand them. He only needed to count. How many people could a field feed? How much land did a poor family need to survive? How long could a soldier march if the countryside still had food? How much unrest could be avoided if bread prices rose, but another crop remained beneath the soil? These were not romantic questions. They were questions of state power. In Europe, grain had always been more than food. When bread became expensive, streets could become dangerous. A bad harvest was not only a rural problem, it could move into cities, markets, barracks, and palaces. Hunger could become politics very quickly. The potato offered a different possibility. It did not replace bread all at once. It entered more quietly, often through the people who had the least room to be proud. Poor families, small farmers, soldiers, prisoners, laborers, those who needed calories more urgently than status. For them, the potato's low reputation could matter less than its ability to fill a stomach. A small plot behind a cottage could become more important than it looked. Under the leaves, underground, the plant could turn rough soil into food dense enough to carry a family through the day. A pot of boiled potatoes did not look like prosperity, but it could postpone hunger. That was the first political lesson. A crop does not need to make people rich to make them governable. Sometimes it only needs to keep them alive. Across parts of Europe, officials, reformers, landlords, and agricultural writers began to see the potato as more than a curiosity. It was a practical answer to bad harvests and crowded populations. It could be promoted in pamphlets, encouraged by decree, planted in demonstration fields, praised by agronomists, and folded into the language of improvement. The potato became part of a new way of thinking about people, not only as subjects with souls, customs, and loyalties, but as bodies that had to be fed. Workers needed food. Soldiers needed food. Cities needed food. Armies moving across land needed food that could be grown, stored, carried, or found. The body became a problem of administration, and the potato became one possible answer. Imagine a village after a poor grain year. The wheat is thin. The price of bread rises. A family cuts smaller slices. A mother stretches soup with whatever can be found. Then someone points to a crop that does not look noble, but has produced enough underground to keep the children eating. In that moment, the potato does not need a myth. It has evidence. This is why stories grew around it. Some were true, some exaggerated, some became national legends. Kings and reformers were later remembered as potato champions. Famous promoters were credited with teaching entire countries to eat what they had once rejected. In Prussia, the story of Frederick the Great became so strong that people still associate him with the potato, even though the most charming version of the tale, royal guards tricking peasants into stealing the crop, belongs more to legend than to reliable history. But myths survive when they express something real. The real change was not that one king fooled a village. The real change was that governments and reformers had begun to understand the potato as a strategic crop. It could reduce famine pressure. It could support rural households. It could feed troops. It could make marginal land matter. It could help populations grow where grain alone might not have been enough. That was the potato's third transformation. In the Andes, it had been a diverse mountain crop shaped by local knowledge. In early Europe, it had been a suspicious stranger. Now it was becoming a tool of population, and tools of population are never innocent. Once a food becomes useful to the powerful, it can be praised for reasons that do not belong to the people eating it. A poor man may value potatoes because his children need dinner. A landlord may value them because a tenant can survive on less land. A state may value them because hungry subjects are dangerous, and fed subjects can work, pay, serve, and fight. The same crop can mean mercy from below and efficiency from above. That is the tension at the heart of the potato's rise. It genuinely helped people. It prevented hunger in many homes. It gave poor families more food from small spaces. It became a backup when grain failed. To pretend otherwise would make the story too simple. But the potato also made poverty easier to manage. If a family could survive on potatoes, then survival itself could be mistaken for justice. If a worker could keep laboring on cheap calories, then the cheapness looked like a solution. If a tenant could feed children from a patch behind the cottage, then the smallness of that patch could be ignored for one more season. The potato did not force that arrangement. It made the arrangement possible. That is why its history keeps turning darker the more useful it becomes. The crop that gave people a buffer against hunger also allowed societies to ask more from people who had very little. More work, more rent, more obedience, more dependence on a plant that seemed almost too reliable to fail. But reliability can become a trap when it is the only thing standing between a family and starvation. By the time the potato became central to the lives of the poorest farmers in Ireland, it had already proved its power. It could feed people on land too small for grain. It could make poverty survivable. It could turn a patch of earth into a daily meal. And that was exactly what made the next chapter so devastating. Because when an entire way of life is balanced on one crop, the question is not whether the crop is useful. The question is, what happens when it finally fails? The potato did not enter Irish life as a curse. For many poor families, it arrived as the opposite. It was the crop that made survival possible when almost everything else was too expensive, too controlled, or too far out of reach. A family with little land could plant potatoes and pull from the ground enough food to stay alive. Not comfortably, not securely, but alive. That distinction matters. Imagine a small cottage before the famine. The walls are damp. The roof does not fully keep out the weather. Outside, the patch of land is not large enough to promise independence. It is not a farm in the way a wealthy landowner might imagine a farm. It is a narrow margin between hunger and another day. Inside, a pot hangs over the fire. When the lid is lifted, there is no feast, no abundance, no sign that life is fair. Only steam rising from boiled potatoes. A mother breaks them open. A child waits. A man eats quickly because work, rent, and weather will not wait for him. The potato makes this scene possible. It also makes it bearable enough for others to ignore. That was the hidden cruelty. The crop was genuinely useful. It gave more food from less land. It allowed poor families to survive in conditions that should have been impossible to defend. But because it worked so well, the deeper arrangement could remain in place. Small holdings, high rents, insecure tenancy, limited wages, a rural economy where many people did not own the ground that fed them. The potato did not create that world. It softened the edge of it. And when a hard system is softened by one crop, people in power may mistake survival for stability. By the early 19th century, the potato had become central to the diet of many of Ireland's poorest people. It was not the food of choice in the comfortable sense. It was the food that fit the trap. Grain could be sold. Livestock could be rented, traded, or taken to market. But potatoes could feed a family directly from a small piece of land. That made them precious. It also made them dangerous, because the more a family depended on potatoes, the less room remained for failure. A bad year was not simply a disappointment. It was the removal of the floor beneath the house. There was no large reserve waiting in the cupboard, no second crop strong enough to replace it, no secure wage that could easily buy food when the patch failed. The potato was not just dinner. It was the structure holding the poor above starvation. Then the leaves began to blacken. At first, the signs could be mistaken for weather damage or ordinary disease. A plant that had looked green and alive could collapse with terrifying speed. The leaves darkened, the stems weakened. Beneath the soil, the tubers turned soft and foul. A farmer did not need a scientist's name for the pathogen to understand what it meant. He only had to smell the field. Picture a man kneeling in the mud, pulling up what should have been food. His fingers close around something that gives way too easily. The skin breaks. The inside is dark. The smell rises. He stands there with a ruined potato in his hand. And for a moment, the disaster is still small enough to fit in his palm. But it is not small. It is breakfast gone, rent gone, seed gone, winter gone, the next meal gone before it is cooked. And because so many people had been forced so close to the edge, the failure of the crop did not remain an agricultural problem. It became a human collapse. This is the part that must not be simplified. The blight struck the potato, but the famine struck a society already made vulnerable. The disease could destroy plants. It could not, by itself, decide who owned land, who paid rent, who had wages, who had reserves, who received relief, who was evicted, and who had to leave. Those decisions belonged to human systems. That is why the Irish catastrophe was not merely a story of biology. It was a story of exposure. The potato had hidden how little protection stood beneath the poor. When it failed, the hidden structure became visible all at once. The small rented plots, the dependence on one crop, the distance between landlord and tenant, the faith that markets and relief systems would somehow do enough. The cruel arithmetic of a country where food could still move through trade while people starved. In the cottage, the pot over the fire became a different kind of object. Before, it had held plain food, repetitive food, food that might have seemed lowly to someone looking from above. But now, even that plainness became a memory. A family could look at the pot and understand that the old poverty had contained a terrible privilege. At least there had been something to boil. Hunger changes the meaning of objects. A spade is no longer only a tool. It is the thing that turns over earth and confirms there is nothing left. A sack is no longer only storage. It is what a person carries when leaving home. A road is no longer only a road. It is the line between a village and exile. During the worst years, Ireland did not simply lose food. It lost people. Some died in cottages, fields, workhouses, fever sheds, and along roads. Others left by ship, carrying famine not as an event they had studied, but as a memory in the body. Hunger traveled with them. So did grief. So did anger. The potato had once tied poor families to small plots of Irish soil. Its failure helped tear many of them away from it. And still, the crop itself was not the villain. That is what makes this history more disturbing. If the potato had been useless, no one would have built so much survival around it. If it had been weak, no landlord, tenant, reformer, or government would have leaned on it so heavily. The tragedy came partly from its strength. It produced enough food to make an unjust arrangement last, until disease revealed the cost. A whole society had been asking one crop to do too much: feed the poor, hide the poverty, support the rent, stretch the land, keep wages low, quiet the hunger, make life continue in cabins where almost nothing else was secure. For a while, the potato answered. Then it could not. In the blackened fields of Ireland, the potato's meaning changed again. It was no longer only the crop that filled the pot. It became evidence of what happens when survival is balanced on something too narrow, too fragile, and too convenient for those who benefit from the balance. The dead fields did not prove that the potato had failed humanity. They proved that humanity had failed the people left with nothing but potatoes. And after that, the world could never honestly look at this crop as simple food again. The next machine in the potato's history was not a famine. It was a factory. After Ireland, the potato could no longer be treated as simple food. It had shown two opposite truths at once. It could keep people alive, and it could expose how fragile survival became when too much depended on it. But the modern world did not turn away from the crop. It did what the modern world often does with useful things. It made them faster. Picture a potato entering an industrial plant. It does not arrive as a story. It arrives as weight. A truck tips its load. Thousands of tubers roll forward, dusty, uneven, still carrying the memory of soil. They are washed, sorted, inspected, peeled, measured, moved by water, moved by belts, moved by steel. The individual potato begins to disappear, not because it is gone, because it is being made repeatable. A blade does what hands once did, but faster and without hesitation. The potato is pushed through cutting equipment and becomes strips. The strips fall in lines. They are rinsed, blanched, dried, fried partly, frozen hard, shaken into bags, sealed, stacked, and sent into cold storage. From there, they can travel farther than a fresh potato ever could, and wait longer than a restaurant kitchen ever wanted to wait. The old problem had been hunger. The new problem was consistency. A fast food restaurant cannot build a global promise around a potato that changes too much. One farm may produce large tubers, another smaller ones. One batch may brown differently. One cook may cut thick pieces, another thin ones. A customer in one city might get crisp fries, while another gets limp ones. Industry hates that kind of uncertainty. So the potato was redesigned without being genetically transformed in the eyes of the consumer. It was redesigned by selection, machinery, storage, contracts, temperature, oil, packaging, logistics, and expectation. The goal was not only to make fries. The goal was to make the same fry again and again. That was a new kind of power. In the Andes, the potato had survived by being many things. In industrial food, it gained value by becoming one thing reliably. A strip of potato had to hit the eye the same way, the mouth the same way, the fryer the same way, and the clock the same way. Its success was measured in seconds, portion size, color charts, freezer space, and profit margins. The crop that had once answered a mountain climate now had to answer a restaurant timer. Imagine the worker at the fryer. They do not dig. They do not choose seed. They do not smell blight in the field. They open a bag. The fries are already shaped before the shift begins. They pour them into the basket, lower them into oil, wait for the alarm, lift, shake, salt, and serve. The labor is still there, but it has been moved to a different point in the chain. It is faster, narrower, and easier for the customer not to see. A box of fries can feel effortless because the effort has been divided into places the eater never enters. Field, storage shed, processing plant, freezer truck, warehouse, restaurant line. Each stage removes a little more of the original potato from view. And yet, this industrial potato is not fake. That is what makes it so effective. It still comes from soil. It still depends on weather, disease control, water, workers, fuel, machines, and land. But by the time it reaches the customer, it has been translated into convenience so completely that it feels almost natural. The potato becomes a side order, a snack, a default, a thing added without ceremony because it is cheap enough, quick enough, and familiar enough to require no explanation. That was not inevitable. It had to be built. The rise of frozen fries depended on cold chains, food service systems, restaurant standardization, and a public trained to expect speed. In the United States, processed potato products became central to the potato market, especially frozen French fries. The crop did not only move from farms to kitchens, it moved from farms into a system designed to make delay disappear. But delay is part of food. A whole potato asks for time. It must be washed, cut, boiled, baked, watched, seasoned. It shows irregularity. It has eyes, skin, bruises, size differences. It reminds the cook that it came from the ground. A frozen fry asks for almost none of that memory. Its shape has already been decided. Its cooking path has already been narrowed. Its future has already been written. Freezer, fryer, salt, box, hand, mouth. The potato's darkest modern transformation is not that it became unhealthy or cheap or common. Those are only pieces of the story. The deeper transformation is that it became abstract. It stopped asking people to recognize it as a crop with a past. It became a unit of service. That is why the factory belongs after the famine in this history. The famine revealed what happens when a society depends too narrowly on one crop. The factory reveals a different narrowing, not the narrowing of survival, but the narrowing of form. The potato is no longer many colors in an Andean field, no longer a strange tuber on a European table, no longer a desperate meal in an Irish cottage. It is a product engineered for sameness, and sameness has its own hunger. It asks farmers for certain sizes. It asks processors for certain solids. It asks workers for speed. It asks restaurants for constant supply. It asks customers to expect the same taste every time, everywhere, with no visible history attached. The potato did not disappear into modern life by accident. It was cut into shapes modern life could use. And once the potato became fast enough, uniform enough, and cheap enough, the final transformation could happen. It no longer had to be the food that kept people alive. It could become the food people consumed without thinking. The potato's final trick is that it can sit directly in front of you and still disappear. Not physically. Physically, it is everywhere. It is in the drive-through window, the snack aisle, the freezer drawer, the school cafeteria, the stadium concession stand, the late-night meal eaten in a parked car under fluorescent light. It is hot, salted, packaged, portioned, and handed over so quickly that it barely feels like a crop at all. That is the modern trap. A person reaches into a paper bag and pulls out a fry. The movement is small, automatic. There is no ceremony in it, no field, no harvest, no history, just heat, salt, oil, and the brief comfort of something familiar. But the potato has always been most powerful when it answers a need people do not stop to examine. In the Andes, the need was survival in a difficult landscape. In Europe, it became the need to feed growing populations. In Ireland, it became the narrow meal that kept poor families alive until the crop failed. In the factory, it became the need for speed, storage, and sameness. Now it answers another need, the need for food that fits a life moving too fast. The modern potato does not usually ask you to cook. It asks you to open, pour, heat, eat, and move on. It belongs to a world where lunch can be swallowed between tasks, dinner can be bought through a car window, and hunger can be answered without ever slowing the day enough to think about what is being eaten. That does not make every fry sinister. It makes the fry revealing, because convenience always has a hidden architecture. Someone has to grow the right kind of potato. Someone has to select the variety that fries well, stores well, ships well, and cuts into the shape a restaurant can use. Someone has to manage disease, water, soil, contracts, machines, cold storage, labor schedules, transport routes, cooking standards, and the expectation that the final product will taste the same every time. The consumer sees a side order. The chain sees a system of obedience. The potato has been trained for modern life. So have we. In the supermarket, a bag of chips does not look like agriculture. It looks like entertainment. The package is bright. The sound is sharp. The potato inside has been sliced so thin, fried so crisp, flavored so aggressively, and separated so completely from the field that it feels closer to a signal than a harvest. Eat more. Reach again. Finish the bag. Buy another. A crop that once helped human beings endure scarcity is now also used to manufacture appetite after hunger has already been answered. That is a strange reversal. For centuries, the potato mattered because it could fill the stomach. In modern snack culture, it often matters because it can keep the hand moving. Salt, fat, crunch, flavor dust, portion size. Packaging the potato becomes a delivery system for repetition. The old question was, will there be enough food? The new question is, can food be made so available, so cheap, and so engineered that people stop recognizing it as part of a larger bargain? This is where the story bends back toward the Andes. The first potato world was full of difference. Thousands of native varieties in the Andean highlands carried different colors, shapes, textures, and strengths. Some were adapted to cold, some to altitude, some to difficult soil. That diversity was not nostalgia. It was protection. The modern potato world is not always built that way. Industrial systems prefer predictability. They reward crops that fit machines, contracts, storage, shipping, and frying standards. They need potatoes that behave. That does not mean diversity has vanished, or that all modern farming is careless. But it does mean the pressure of the market often points toward narrowing. Fewer shapes, fewer uses, fewer visible stories, more uniform performance. And history has already shown what narrowing can cost. The lesson of Ireland was not that potatoes are dangerous. The lesson was that any food system becomes dangerous when too many people are forced to depend on too little variety, too little land, too little protection, and too little power. That lesson is not trapped in the 19th century. Climate stress, crop disease, food prices, supply chains, and consumer habits still decide who eats easily and who lives close to the edge. The potato remains one of the world's great food crops, but its future depends on a question older than fast food and older than empire. How much difference can a food system afford to keep? In a drive-through, none of this is visible. The fries are simply there, golden, familiar, disposable. They sit beside the burger like an afterthought, even though they carry one of the longest histories on the tray. A hand reaches for another. The car moves forward. The box empties, and the potato completes its modern transformation. It is no longer only the crop that kept people alive, or the crop whose failure exposed a nation's suffering, or the crop that machines learned to make identical. It has become something even more powerful. A food so ordinary that the world it came from can vanish while we are still eating it. The next time you hold a potato, it may not feel like history. It may feel like dinner, a side dish, a snack, a handful of fries cooling in a paper box, something ordinary enough to salt without thinking. But the potato has never been only ordinary. Inside it is a mountain field where people learn to farm against frost, altitude, and hunger. Inside it is a night in the Andes, with tubers freezing under the stars before hands press the water out and turn fresh food into something that can wait for the future. Inside it is a wooden box crossing the ocean, carrying an ugly stranger into Europe. A plant that did not look like bread, a thing people doubted before they depended on it. Inside it is a ruler's calculation, a poor family's patch of land, a soldier's ration, a pot over a small fire, the hope that enough food could come from too little earth. And inside it is Ireland, a field going black, a man holding a rotten tuber in his palm, a cottage where the pot no longer promises dinner, a road where people leave because the crop that kept them alive has failed, and nothing strong enough stood beneath them when it did. The potato survived that history. It kept changing shape. Machines washed it, peeled it, cut it, froze it, and taught it to become identical. Restaurants dropped it into oil. Packages made it bright. Salt made it automatic. Modern life turned it into something so fast and familiar that its past could vanish between one bite and the next. That is the strange command hidden inside this crop. Grow more from less. Feed more bodies. Move faster. Cost less. Look the same. Do not ask too many questions. The potato has fed the hungry. It has protected the poor. It has strengthened states, crossed empires, exposed famine, filled factories, and become one of the quietest symbols of modern convenience. But its deepest lesson is not that one crop changed the world. Its deepest lesson is that survival can be a gift, or it can become a trap, depending on who controls the land, the labor, the risk, and the choices left to the people eating it. So the potato is still small enough to hold in one hand, but inside it is one of the largest questions humans have ever faced. What happens when survival becomes a system someone else controls?